All right, good morning. We're going to get started. Who came to one of these sessions yesterday? Did you have fun? What'd you learn? Brett, what'd you learn? Yeah, pretty easy, right? Slam dunk, not that hard, low ramp. Yeah, these talks aren't for the faint of heart if you're trying to do the same things that you see people talking about up here. So the extracurricular is community content. This is content that was created, selected, curated, evolved by the community, right? We sort of self-manage this track at TDX. It's an interesting format. What we're trying to accomplish here is conversational learning. It's sort of an upper tier of ways to learn. At some point, you hit a limit reading books or reading blogs or trying to understand things, looking at code, and you have to have a conversation with a human being that's already done what you'd like to do. And you say, how did you do that? And did you get stuck here too? And what would you do to get around this particular roadblock? And to sit with someone and have a conversation like that is an excellent way to get to another level of ability. And it's hard to artificially create opportunities for those conversations. But these sessions are an attempt to do just that, which is to create a moment where you can have an actual conversation with a capable, intelligent, experienced person that has done a challenging thing and try to sort of pick apart their brain and understand how they did it and what was their process. And it's our deep desire that you not just understand the topic that they're talking about, but the process by which they solve problems. And I really want to help you learn to fish. I want you to see the way these people solve these problems so you can start emulating some of those patterns yourself and get better at problem solving. So that's what these are about. The format's different. It's kind of a long format. We'll be in here for about 90 minutes. And it's like an onion. We're going to take this complex topic, and we're going to peel it back one layer at a time and go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. So we start out with about a 20, 25-minute presentation from the speaker, and that's actually not the presentation. That's just setting up the actual reason we're here, which is the conversation that takes place afterwards. The Q&A is the session. That's what this is all about. So we'll do sort of a setup of, hey, here's what we're about to talk about, and then we're going to spend about 45 minutes talking about it. And you don't have to stick around the whole time. It's okay. We tend to lose people as time goes on. That's okay. You hit a limit of how much you want to learn or just your brain gets fried. But at the end, there'll be some subset of this group still sitting here an hour and a half from now talking about this topic. And that's really rewarding for those people. So get as much of this, as much as you can or would like to out of this session. I hope that you really enjoy the format. My name is Chuck Liddell. I'm one of the co-organizers. I run a company that does a lot of integrations. And I'm really happy to bring this presentation to you. Please take notes as you go about things you'd like to ask questions about, because it tends to because such a long session, it might be some time before you get a chance in front of the mic. Okay, so format-wise, we actually have sort of some bonus content at the start of one of these, which is our quick talks. Quick talks are kind of opening acts for our headliner. And these are 5-minute talks about just something cool that we think you'd be interested to hear about. So we're going to do 2 of those, and then we'll dive into our main session, which is an amazing Heroku app that I'm really excited for you to hear about because I think it's super cool. All right, let's dive in. Our first quick talk today. Let me pull up my intro sheet here. All right, our first intro talk is Jim Bartek. Come on up, Jim. Jim is the founder, CEO, and lead consultant for Growth Heroes, a Salesforce consulting and ISV partner. He is also the creator of a SaaS accounting app for Salesforce called Sales to Cash. Take it away to Jim.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks a lot for putting on the extracurricular. It's been a great program so far. Really just blessed to be up here. Thank you very much. So the problem that we have as kind of small consultancy, ISV, and also with our app and with our consulting clients is how do we actually grow our business, right, as a consultancy and bring more developers in while also maintaining code quality and making it a lot easier for developers to just produce good, clean code, right? And so I've been kind of working down this path for at least 6 months to try to figure out, what's the most appropriate way to try to tackle and block and tackle, how do we manage that code? And so I have a little repository here. It's nothing that special, but it'll get you up and started really quickly if you want to use it. And basically, we just have some kind of highlights of what we're looking at. But before I get into the kind of the repository and kind of how to do a couple of these things, I just want to share a little bit more about some of the problems that we kind of ran into here. So this is from PMD. Everybody's using Git or some sort of code repository system? Okay, how many people are using any sort of things like PMD or ESLint or anything else to kind of clean that code, or Prettier? Okay, and how many people are actually doing that all automatically, where it just does it for you kind of as you commit or in continuous integration? Okay, so that was kind of where we were trying to get to, say, how do we get to a point where we can just always maintain the code and keep it clean? There's an example from a client that they already had a bunch of code and we inherited it. And so at the far left, that's kind of like where we inherited it at, like how many errors and how many PMD warnings we had. And we had like hundreds of SOQLs inside of loops. We had all sorts of stuff that we were inheriting where they were just hitting limits, right? And so we had to say, well, how do we justify spending 6 months doing nothing but rewriting your code base and providing no new features, right? And so we kind of had to use this and say, okay, we're going to automatically track everything we do with PMD and other tools and give reports back to the client to say, we're chipping away at this mountain here, right? And how do we pick which of those errors do we chip away at? So we had issues like this, and we kind of, we narrowed in on those at different things like loops and IDs and things we wanted to get rid of and over time, and how we were getting rid of some of those things. So that's kind of like what we started at, and I was just doing this, with PMD, and I would just run it every time we had a commit. I would just like get the code and run it myself, and then we finally got it set up on like GitLab, so it would do it automatically for us, but you still had to go fetch the CSV file, and you still kind of have some other issues. So we kind of kept progressing and kind of chipping through that and trying to get to where we wanted to be. So before I kind of get into a little bit of that, I'll talk a little bit more about like code templates as well and code framework. You guys, everybody using like a framework, like a trigger framework, and any kind of predefined patterns that you're reusing over and over again in your code? We find it really helpful to say, here's the exact way we write a trigger, here's the exact way we write a trigger handler, here's how we do it every time. You can copy and paste it, you can inherit from a base class and kind of do some of those things to make sure that that's all happening right. And there's tons of examples out there on how to do that, and they're pretty easy to set up. It's been really helpful for us just to be able to agree on a pattern that we always use for new code and that we always try to move old code to if we're trying to maintain someone else's code that we inherited. And then using a base like framework as well, so we actually have common utility classes, common test data factories, and things like that we have in a separate repository that we use for every client project. As we inherit a client project or as we spin up a new organization, we say we always use this same base components. And we're not masters at this by any means, but we're kind of getting in there and getting that done. So anyway, so with that, basically what you can do with this repo is if you download this, or if you fork this, you can run npm install. It'll install Prettier and install some other things, Prettier Apex extension. And then you can just run this command here, this Prettier, right? And it'll look at the folder. This is for ECC. This is our SFDX folder here. And it will look for any triggers or classes, and it'll just automatically run Prettier Apex on it and reformat that code for you. And then also, if you download PMD and put it in the build folder, or if you want, what I would do is set this up and you put PMD as a submodule in your own repo, but for the purpose of the demo, I'm just showing it this way. And then you can run this command to actually just look at that and run PMD on it automatically. So that'll do that there, but the nice thing about doing it this way with your files in the middle is that as you do your commits, you can have it automatically show you what Prettier's doing, right, and see what changes it's making to your files for you. But then you can also get into looking at PMD and looking at other things like Codicy, and it will automatically show you this is the problem that you have. You have SOQL queries inside of loops, right? It'll automatically put that comment on your Git commit for you, saying these problems exist for you. So that's really helpful as well. And then here, if you use a tool like Codicy as well, the great thing about Codicy is if you use PMD, it will always throw an error if you have any one error. So we couldn't use it with our client's code base because it would always say, hey, you have errors. We want to know if we have less errors versus more errors. And if you use Codicy, there's a free version of it. It will only reject the pull request if you have more errors than you had before. And it will use the same rule set files, config files in your repo as you can on the command line, as you can on the IDE. So you can use the same exact config, whether you're the dev doing it or CI is doing it, or you're doing it on the command line. You can do the same everywhere. So take a look at this, and hopefully it helps you guys think more about easy, clean code.
Clayton has been working on the Salesforce platform since 2013, where he started out as a business analyst, but has since done administration, app building, consulting, and now development and architecture on the platform. He is now a Trailhead Ranger, official Lightning champion, 10x certified application architect, and soon-to-be system architect with the aim of one day becoming a CTA. Take it away, Clayton.
Thank you. Okay, 1 second while I get set up here.
I did miss one sentence from Clayton's bio. So he's currently a senior consultant with Salesforce partner 8Cloud and enjoys walks on the beach but burns easily.
I do, yeah. I was just in Hawaii last week and was on the beach for like an hour and burned, so. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting my presentation on the right screen. Yeah, can you give me a hand here?
So what is it you're trying to do?
Just trying to.
You want to just mirror the screens?
No, that wasn't my intention.
Well, what would be best for you? How can I help?
Yeah, that's fine.
Here.
I'll just mirror the screen.
I'll buy you a minute. You want a minute? Yeah, keep working on it. Okay, people that came to an extracurricular session yesterday, which one did you come to? Pick one. Tell me about it. What? The large object one with Matt Morris? Yeah, what's an interesting thing that you learned in that session? What was a takeaway for you? So the design, the different options that he explored, his solution involved multiple options, right? He chose to use big objects and an external sort of deep storage system. Yeah, it's interesting sort of the iterative process that he went through. And when we pressed him in Q&A for why he had big objects, do you remember what he said? He said that it was a decision they had made because they were so pressed for time at the start of the project that they had chosen to use big objects just to relieve some of the cost pressure and storage. And that bought them a few more months to figure out a better design. And in hindsight, he wouldn't have even used big objects if he had designed it differently from the start. Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
All right.
Sorry. Okay, so yeah, Chuck, thanks for the intro and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. So my quick talk is on a little project that we put together for a client. I was working for a client about a year ago. They had a knowledge base in Salesforce, and they had a need to make mass updates to articles that were already published. And this was a challenge because Salesforce does not allow you to make edits to articles that are already published. And you also cannot use data loader to change the publishing status of an article. So users are left to having to create new drafts basically one at a time. And so I had this problem, and I knew that there had to be a better way to go about it. And so I started researching and found in Salesforce's developer site the edit online article. So this is a method that's part of the publishing service class. And so basically this takes the article ID as a string and then can take a parameter of whether you want to keep the existing published article as published or if you want to take it down while you're working on the draft. And so so what I did for that client was I put together basically a little block of code that I could run in Execute Anonymous. And so I just formatted the IDs as strings and added them to a collection, and then just used a for loop to iterate on that collection, creating a new draft article for each of the published articles. But this also required a lot of prep work. Like I was using Excel just to get the articles formatted, and then once the drafts were created, I could then use Data Loader to make the updates to the articles. And then once the updates were done, then I could go into the UI and publish the articles from there. So it was kind of a lot of steps to just do this one thing that I thought should be more straightforward. And so we took that app that I created as sort of a building block, and then created this app that I'll show you. Okay, so here's an org where we have some published articles, and I have a CSV already prepared with some new values to update these articles with. And so we created this app that's basically just a Lightning component that lives on a Lightning page, but it allows you to browse for a CSV, upload the CSV, and see the values contained in that CSV. You can then map the values from the CSV to the updatable fields on the article. So here we'll map ID and summary. And we give you a few different options here as far as whether you want to keep the existing published article as published or not. We also give you the option, as I said, to map your fields that you want to update. And we can even take care of everything in one fell swoop and publish the newly updated versions. So we'll click Create New Article Versions. And there we have status of success. So if we go back to look at these published articles, I'll refresh this list view. And now we can see the articles were updated. So that's the app. I hope that you like that. And if you see value in it, please reach out to me. We'll have the app available for distribution very soon. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Clayton. So I hope you all enjoyed that. Just two quick talks, little cool things someone's working on. We love to have these. We just sprinkle them through the extracurricular. Great chance to talk, especially if you've never done any sort of public speaking before. We don't make you answer any Q&A, right? You just get up there, show your thing, sit down. Whew, all done. All right, we're going to get into our main session here. I'm going to bring up our panel and speaker. So our speaker today is Shane McLaughlin. Shane started building on Salesforce as a customer in winter 11 and drank the Kool-Aid. He joined Salesforce in 2014 so he could snort the concentrated powdered form. His day job is building demos for product marketing. He lives with his high school sweetheart, 3 kids, 2 corgis, and a sheepdog near Houston. Our moderator today is Phil Weinmeister. Phil has held various roles in the Salesforce ecosystem since 2010 and currently heads up the product team at Community's implementation partner 7 Summits. Phil has been a Salesforce MVP since 2015 and has authored 2 Salesforce books, Practical Guide to Salesforce Communities and Practical Salesforce Development Without Code, with the second edition of that book being released in about a week. Yet you still found time to come do this. All right, our first panelist today is Susanna Kate St. Germain. Susanna St. Germain is a 16X certified Colombian-American Salesforce architect. She is actively involved in the Trailblazer community, serving as a co-lead of the Boston Salesforce user group and co-lead of Ladies Be Architects, a community group that helps to build confidence for women on their architect journey. And our second panelist today is Gaurav Kedarpal. Gaurav is a 4X Salesforce MVP, a certified technical instructor, and he currently works at CTO at MTX Group. Gaurav has grown old with Salesforce ecosystem since 2007, got married when he was learning Apex, had his daughter in the days of Flow, and his son was born when Lightning components were introduced. A developer at heart, Gaurav has been a speaker at Dreamforce every year since 2012 and considers Moscone his second home. That's amazing and a little terrifying. All right, so just a repeat on the format here. We're going to do about 20 minutes with Shane talking, kind of setting up the conversation. Then we're going to get into about 45, 50 minutes of Q&A. Panelists will open it up, ask interesting questions. They're going to sort of stimulate the brain juices and get us thinking about what we want to ask about ourselves. Then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. All right, take it away, folks.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Shane. So like the introduction, I'm a developer at Salesforce. I don't get to build any of the platform features that you use. I'm more of like someone who's building on top of the platform. And so I have all the same problems you have with SFDX and the CLI and Lightning components and all that. One of the things that we build quite a bit of is demos and hands-on workshops. So if you go downstairs and kind of go over to Platform Point, there'll be tables set up with machines, and all these people are building all of these workshops. And so our dream, once SFDX came on the scene about 2 years ago, I had just started in this role, and we were manually setting up workshops and spinning up things and handing out credentials on cards, or there was like this entire form that you would fill out that would stop working about midday. And so our dream was pretty much this page. I could put the workshops on a page, and for example, if I want to teach you 5 cool things about LWC in 45 minutes, you would come and you would click this button that says Create Org. And then this is the subject of the talk today, which is this little deployer thing. And so what you're looking at is there's a GitHub repo where this code lives that defines what needs to be in this org, metadata, data, configuration, permissions, all that kind of stuff. And then what's going to happen is I am doing a bash script. So this is an SFDX process. So I'm cloning it from the source here. And then I just created an org. It's a scratch org. I've set -d as 1, so this thing's going to live for 24 hours. And then, some other steps happen. You get perm sets. We maybe load some data, push some source, set some user passwords. And then the user says, great. And I'm in an org. Okay. So the important requirements here are that no one authenticates to anything. No one fills out a form. You push a button, and you get something. And then there's a username and password that some of the workshops don't even have, some of the more admin-focused things. And this one, we're going to connect our VS Code and authenticate to this scratch org so we can do push-pull stuff to it. So I needed to throw up that username and password. Some of the stuff we're like, oh, go Heroku Connect. There's things that we need that for. And it's going to expire in 24 hours, but if not, it's gone. So it's queued for deletion. Cool. So this talk is really about the origin story of this project, how it came about, and all the fun challenges that happen. The initial approach for this was, hey, anyone know Wade Wegner? Anyone seen this thing he built? It was like, you can come and you can point at a GitHub repo, and if you have a dev hub, you can sign into your dev hub and do the OAuth flow, and then point at a repo, and it would deploy a scratch org. So I was like, I'm just going to steal Wade's thing. But mine is even stupider, because instead of you having to authenticate your own hub, we're just all going to use my scratch orgs. Right? So how hard could this possibly be? And all good projects start off with how hard could this possibly be? So one of the things that you first run into is Wade had done this with a YAML file. It was like you could install a package, you can assign a perm set, you could load some data, but you couldn't really do those things in different orders. It's like, oh, do I need to install a package and then install the perms from that and then load data and then run Apex tests, or does it need to happen? Do I depend on the package, or does the package happen after me? And the permutations of how you could describe that in a YAML file became like impossibly large really quick. So then I was like, you know what? Let's just do it this way, where this is the stuff that I need to load in this org. So I've got some Aura components, I got some LWC, the stuff that we just looked at. And what all I want to do is run a bash script. And the nice thing is I can build this locally, and it's going to run the same commands as it does there. Okay? So this opens up two relatively serious problems. One is security. Right? I would like to take some GitHub thing and let strangers execute bash scripts on my Heroku dyno, right? And so one of the challenges that I dealt with there is what will I let you do and what will I not let you do? So I've got a whole set of bash characters that you're not allowed to use, and then I'm also going to check and verify that your commands start with SFDX and you cannot have any piping going around or stuff like that. The exception is if the person who owns the deployer, in this case me or anyone else who has spun up a copy of this instance, also has permissions on it. And so, for example, we've got a whitelist. So you might be a whitelisted GitHub user, or this repo might be whitelisted, in which case I'll execute whatever you have in your GitHub, and I'm not going to enforce any of the shell character restrictions. So security was one of those big things. And if you work at Salesforce, it's like a really, really big thing. If you've ever been through our App Exchange review process, it's even worse if you're putting your name on it. So that was kind of what those bash scripts look like. I have a more complicated one, and this kind of ties into the session we saw yesterday with building out Scratch orgs. This is an internal demo that we use, and you'll see I'm creating an org. I'm taking a connected app and uniquifying the connected app ID because they can't match. And then you'll start to see things like, oh, I'm going to upload a bunch of data sets to Einstein Analytics. And so there's not a command for that. There's an API for that. There's a REST API. And so to make this kind of friendly on the deployer, I have a bunch of SFDX plugins. There's a whole repository of these things. There's sort of how do I do a packaging approach? So I actually have some base packages. So we talk about this whole second generation package thing on SFDX. But what I didn't want to do is every time someone modifies a base package, I have to go change it in 20 repos. Because remember, unlike most customers, you might have like one big org that you build and one big source control project. I have like hundreds of these, lots of demos, all these hands-on workshops, and like all this one-off stuff that we do. And so this command just says, go to this GitHub repo and go look in the project file and find the most recent package ID and install that, right? So there's a lot of kind of little problem solvings around this, and we'll kind of come back to plugins a little bit later. The other thing, if you've worked with Heroku very much, the other challenge is Heroku has a 30-second request response timeout. And so the thing that Wade was originally building, it would send a command, and then that command would run on the SFDX that's installed on a dyno, and then you would get back the results. Anything that took longer than 30 seconds was going to cause a problem. So pretty much any non-trivial repo, installing a package almost never takes less than 30 seconds. So we started to hit some of those things. And so the architecture of this on the Heroku side, it starts to look like a server on the web server side. So this is the web server. Anytime you hit that, this is what's serving up your stuff. It's Express. It's as simple as possible for Node. And then what's going to happen is when that request comes in, for example, if you wanted to do a launch of an org, I'm going to put this deploy request onto a Redis queue. And then I'm also going to then start a worker that's going to process those queues. And so this was our way of dealing with these long-running requests. And then that worker is going to start building the SFDX commands. And like for a really large org, it might take 15 minutes to build out and run all that execution steps. That's kind of my worst case scenario. But if you're a customer, that might be normal for you, as we saw with doTERRA yesterday. And so then as those commands get executed, the results of that go back onto another Redis queue. So then the web server is just listening for those messages and forwarding them back to whoever requested that deployment. So that gives us a nice ability to deal with the long-term things. The other thing that we didn't have was like the sticky sessions. So if you are requesting one of these deployments, I can't always guarantee that you're going to go back to the worker that built your org. So this way, by putting a layer of web server, Redis queues for inbound and outbound messages, and then the actual worker dynos, that let us divorce these two things. The other thing that we started to deal with as this thing became popular and get used is the scale of that. And so for today, since we're here at TDX, I have 20 of these builders running. And that's a lot of money, even for Salesforce marketing. And so those are going to usually be 3 on most days. They're just 20 for TDX right now. And so one of the challenges is, if I know I'm doing an event, I can bump this up to 20. But I had this little event that happened where I was home building something, and we got an instant message from the folks at London World Tour, who are like way ahead of us on time zones. It's like, hey, we've been doing this thing all morning. The orgs have been working fine, but now the workshops are really slow to spin up. It's taking like 15 minutes to get an org, okay? And then like 2 minutes later, I got a G-chat. Hey, I'm a sales engineer, and I've got like 40 customers here at some big company, big name company you would recognize, and it's running really slow, right? And so like if I had known, I would have bumped up the dynos, but the question was, how do you get to like burst capacity? And so this is the builder that's always running. There's also a one-off dyno concept. So if you haven't done this on Heroku, a one-off dyno, you can just execute it. It will run its whatever node things that it's doing. And so I'll show you what that process looks like. So in my processes, I have a deploy one-off. So it's actually going to go through the same process that the workers are doing, which is they build whatever's on the queue, and then they check the queue again, and then they check the queue again, sort of in an infinite loop. The one-offs will just wake up, load all the stuff that they need to do as part of their script, and then they will check the queue and build it, and then they exit. They just go away. And so the pattern that came out here is not only do you put a message on the queue, but you actually start a builder. And so if I'm running local, it's going to spin up with like a Heroku local type commands. If it's actually running on real Heroku, then it's going to run this one-off builder. So it spins up a dyno just to make sure that you put something on the work queue, you also put a worker, you also booted up a worker. And so the worst case scenario is I have 5 workers and I have 50 people that make a request at one time. The only time they have to wait is that extra 30 seconds for a dyno to wake up and then handle their request. So it kind of like horizontally scales out really nicely. So that solved my scaling issue for burst capacity. The other thing that we started to run into is the example that I showed you earlier. It loaded in about a minute. It took to build that scratch org. We have some workshops that take more like 10 minutes, and we have some demos that take more like 15 minutes. And so there is this question of how long would a customer actually sit and wait for this thing? And one of the things we run on the deployer is also our public-facing trial where someone fills out a form and they're like, I want to play around with the Salesforce platform with a bunch of stuff pre-installed. And they're not going to wait at all, right? And that platform trial org is actually kind of large, and it's more of like a 10-minute experience. And so we looked at ways to solve this, and one of the things that we ended up doing is what's called org pools. And so I have here in my code, this thing is going to go look at a file of pool configuration and say, what all orgs do I need to have built, and how many are there? Okay. And then where this actually lives is as a JSON file. So what I'm saying here is there should always be 4 platform trials ready at any moment in time so that when someone clicks the button, they get one immediately. And so what this would look like if you were on one of these, well, I'm trying to think of what is probably queued up. So Lightning reports and dashboards. It takes a really long time to build because we have to create all of these extra users and then load all this data so the people that are doing the workshop have fun and can do their reports, right? So what did I just do? I went into that pool of orgs that they're always sitting there. And so if I come back to our, somewhere, there we go. This reporting workshop, there's always 5. And the next time this little thing runs through and it looks and sees that there's only 4, it's going to go start creating another one, so they're always queued up. And there's also a lifetime expiration on these things, because most of my scratch orgs for workshops only live 24 hours. And so I don't want someone to like start working a workshop and then their org gets killed because it expired in the middle of it. And so if these things are more than 12 hours old, there's a little skimmer that's running every hour or so, and it's going and finding anything that's kind of getting close to that expiration time, killing it, and then that'll also cause it to rebuild that new fresh org. So we always keep orgs in queues. So if you are thinking about doing what doTERRA was doing yesterday, but you also don't want to have those things sitting around waiting a long time to do your build steps, it probably looks something like this little queue. And this is also another Redis. And so when a request comes in, and there's I've got a little thing here called pooled org finder. And so when I look at your deploy request, one of the first things that I go and ask is, hey, do I have an org? Do I have any orgs in the pool for that? And if so, then I have to re-authenticate to them, because you're probably not the same dyno that built that org. It may be sitting there for a while, and it's horizontally elastic. So I'm just going to reconnect to that. And then there's some things that have to happen. So maybe I need to apply your email. Maybe there was a password that got set on it. So I need to go get all those things again and sort of recreate the last few steps of your org spin-up process from this pooled org. And that's how we make that happen. And then the next thing that happened was, okay, that's great. If we know that I need to pool some things, I can be like, oh, you're doing a big lightning workshop. Let me go add 80 to your pool, and then I'll go change the pool back to something else. So also that got, you can tell I'm the laziest developer ever. That also started to be like too much work to keep up with administrating all these pools for all these different marketing events that we run. And so this one ended up in a Salesforce app that I'm not on the network, so I'm not going to show you. But you can imagine a Salesforce object where you have pools and all those definitions. And so what you're looking at here is the result of Apex REST. This is a public force.com site, and it's serving up this. And so what I wanted to be able to do is I have a sub-object called temporary pool that you can say, hey, I don't want 4 for platform trial. I need 50 extra ones just for Thursday. And so we do this internally. A bunch of our marketing teams can go and say, I just need more orgs. And the way this works is kind of the funniest thing. We decided to make a chatbot for it because this is customer facing. So we have this program called Workshop in a Box, whereas you might do a workshop here at TDX that we're leading, but then you might be like, hey, I totally want to show all of my new users how to do lightning reports and dashboards, because now they're all going to have to do this thing. And so we don't know who's using this. I can't let them in my Salesforce org to touch data and see other people's stuff and all that. So what's this question? So what are you doing? I'm doing flows. Okay, cool. I have 2 of those workshops, and there's kind of 2 levels of our flow workshops. Which one are you doing? Oh, okay, this one. Okay. Next question. What are you talking about? When is this? And so, appropriate answers here might be like this, but also this is an okay answer. You just kind of get some of those conversational chatbot features. And you don't have to have looked at my web form or understand my UI. You just kind of answer the questions as you go. And then, I got 50 people coming to this thing. And then we just like to know what you're doing with it, so I know that they're not like tests, right? So if it's like for TDX, you can say that. And then we just ask you this, and at this point, you write it in. And then on the day, as the deployer is checking for how many there should be, you would see the extra 50 plus the 4 that are in that base pool show up. So it's like I don't have to manage this. People can just go in and request it, and it gets put in there. And then after that day, whenever those orgs start expiring or after they've been all used for their workshop, it stops building them. So again, I get to not pay attention to marketing events and kind of be more lazy with that. Let's see, what else? One of the other things that we have going on downstairs is this is in a Heroku pipeline. And so we have a workshop that we're running today that is change data capture. Think like 3 things you can do with change data capture. One of those is change data capture Apex triggers, which is a summer 19 feature. And my hub is currently running on the spring release, like most production orgs. And so I actually have another dev hub that's running pre-release. And this lets me take the same code base and spin it up on 2 different places. And so you can see both the production instances of the deployer are on the same Git commit, but they are authenticated to different hubs, and hubs will spawn orgs that are on the same release that they are on. Okay, so that lets us kind of manage. It lets us manage the timing of these things. And then in terms of other things that are going on, some of the one-off dyno processes, like that skimmer that needs to check every hour or the thing that's watching the pool, those are all running with Heroku Scheduler, which lets you just say, hey, this process that's defined on this dyno should run at this time. And that gives me, it's almost like cron tab for little one-off Heroku apps. And so I guess the last thing that I wanted to show you was where all of these plugins live. And it's gotten to where my plugin set is starting to get as large as the SFDX core commands, but they're all here. And so there's a lot of really common things that I want to do. So for example, if I need to publish a community, this happens a lot on demos. And when I originally built this, I had to do browser driving, like we saw yesterday in Doterra's presentation. This is now moved in the summer release into an actual REST API where you can publish a community by ID. And that lets, now in this command, all I have to do is check the version number. And if you're on 46, I'm going to use a REST API. If you're on 45, I'm going to leave that legacy browser driving code on there. And so there's commands for whole bunches of stuff. One of the ones that's particularly useful is a profile whitelist command. So if you've ever spun up a Scratch org and then you try to use it with your mobile app, or you try to have someone come on, then they get like IP challenged. You know, it's like, hey, can you go get the single sign-on security code that we texted or emailed to whoever owns this org? And of course, that's me. Sorry. And I was getting all those emails. So this is a command that says, hey, take the admin profile and whitelist the whole internet for it. And then that can push that in my source. And so that works really great for Scratch orgs. Don't do it in production, but it's really handy. So there's a whole plugin library here. And then the entire deployer is open source. So we've got a bunch of teams within Salesforce that are using this. And so it walks you through what you have to do minimal setup. And then, you know, I've got things like Google Analytics tracking, just in case my boss wants to know how many workshop Scratch orgs did we build yesterday. Well, we did 436. And then, you know, so there's other kind of features there. But what's really cool is there's a Heroku button. So you can just push the Heroku button, and it'll deploy this for you on Heroku. And then you can decide which of those features you need. Like, do I need org pools? How do I, you know, you can put in your hub credentials and that kind of stuff. And then there's examples of what to build for pools. There's examples of how to run this thing locally and run all the jest unit tests, which is, this is a bad app to break. And so that's really handy. And then at the very bottom, there's kind of some launcher examples. So you can kind of see what it takes to, you know, point at a GitHub repo and say, go deploy this code. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel and let them ask me anything.
Nice, thank you, Shane. I have one point of disagreement. You are not the laziest developer in the world.
Okay, you're going to challenge me for that?
Yes.
Okay.
You do have a desire to streamline. That's good. It's fair to say you could probably speak for quite a while on this topic, so I know you did a good job fitting it into 20 minutes. What we're going to do is allow Gaurav and Susanna to ask some questions now. For those of you who have been in the extracurricular already, you understand the format, but I just want to encourage you, if you haven't already, just be jotting down your thoughts. This is an awesome opportunity to pick Shane's brain, and you'll get that in just a few minutes. So just, if you have questions already, great. Gaurav and Susanna might spur on some additional thoughts, so be prepared. And then in around 20 minutes, we'll just open it up to everyone, and you can just take a mic, and I'll just call on you guys. So with that, do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, I have tons of questions. Maybe I'll start with, have you found anything that you couldn't accommodate for in a plugin? Like, I'm thinking about, like, our org currently just started to use SFDX, and trying to find some of just the commands, like to enable enterprise territory management, was tough to find. So is there anything that you found that you could not accommodate for?
No, it's just a matter, like once you've committed to this path, it's just a question of how much work do you want to do. And so like I described sort of like an inverted triangle of this. It's like some of my commands just wrap existing SFDX commands, and I just wanted a friendly password, you know. And then there's like things where I need to either run Apex scripts or then like the harder ones are like I'm writing stuff that's only accessible in the API, or like I'm editing local metadata and doing like a push for like that profile whitelisting thing. And then like the inner, circle of the inferno is I have to go browser driving, like you saw yesterday. And it's like, if you're gonna commit to that, Puppeteer is loaded on every Heroku dyno as part of the Heroku build packs that are on there. So if you could do it in the UI, you can really do it. It's just, you may spend your whole morning trying to create the perfect Puppeteer script and like parse through 3 levels of iframes to find it.
Yeah, so I've actually been using DX since the very early days, since it started off as an experimental project with the Wade. And the first thing you said, you're a lazy developer, but you're a fairly smart marketer. You managed to sneak in an Einstein bot within a DX presentation, so well done on that. My question is more around the scale. We saw that you have about 20 odd workshops being spinned up. I'm more interested in the larger numbers. So for example, for an event like Dreamforce, where you need to pretty much scale up thousands of orgs, is it possible to scale the dynos on Heroku dynamically as well, based on real-time load?
Yeah, so this is Dreamforce last, 782 was a big day. It's sort of layers of fallback. So yes, I can put 50 dynos on it, and that's not a bad idea for Dreamforce, but having that burst capacity where I'm gonna spin up additional dynos to clean out that queue is like my fallback. Because in worst case for this customer, it's like 30 extra seconds, or whoever is using it. And so it's like layers of defense against scale. Heroku does have some limits. I think if you are, as long as you're a paid account, I think they'll give you like 100 dynos at a time. So I can't spin up thousands of one-offs, and that's really where the pools come in, because if I've already got those pools built and they're sitting in my Redis queue, then the workers don't have to do very much. They just get in the pool, grab an org, and hand it back, so they can churn through things really quickly. Whereas if I didn't have those pools, there's a decent chance that I could get into like a worker shortage bind. And so what we do is like before an event like this, we just start to pool things with larger numbers with those little temporary queues. Yeah, you gotta be careful with that. And then if you ask Heroku, they'll also raise that number for you, especially if you're paying them. It's 100 by default, but they'll go up if you make a ticket.
It helps that Salesforce acquired Heroku a while back.
Yeah.
So one question around scale. You mentioned that your larger projects can take 10 to 15 minutes to spin up. What does that look like? What does the metadata in what a larger project for you look like?
For those larger projects, it's not really the metadata that's making the stuff slow. So this is probably, the one I showed earlier is probably one of the worst ones. Packages are just going to take a minute, even if like this one is nothing but like lightning themes and content assets and some other like, branding kind of stuff. The force source push of all the metadata is always not the biggest thing, especially if you start to do packages. You can deal with smaller source, but you defer some of that work to packages. Some of the Apex execution, I've got 4 of those that have to happen, and then there's like data tree imports. You can choose to wait for a bulk load or not, but if you need to update a bunch of records or push in a bunch of records, and you run that bulk load, but then you have some steps down in your script that depend on that being complete, you can put a -W20 and like wait for 20 minutes for that bulk API transaction to finish. But it's more of like if you have like a single threaded dependency that runs through the whole thing, you just have to wait for all those steps to happen. And it's not necessarily the metadata that's causing the problems.
So you mentioned it's a worker-based architecture, so I presume it's asynchronous. Any caveats in terms of, there is always a possibility that a script was picked up by one of the workers and eventually got served by another worker thread. Any caveats in terms of concurrency or in terms of parallelism, especially when we are talking about scale?
Yeah, so the workers are all, they're all independent dynos. So I'm using the smallest dyno, like the standard one, and so they're all working one thing at a time. So they go to the request and they start working that one. They don't try to pick up multiple things. So like that, I didn't go down that path very long before I realized it was going to be awful to try to manage memory and size and stuff like that on some of these deploys. But yeah, having all those dynos sort of as their own standalone, they're only building one thing at a time, has kept has kept them very elastic and independent. The other thing that I did see for a while is sometimes you have a script that sucks, and it's like the script's fault, it's not the deployer's fault, and it'll just get stuck in a command that never returns because I'm using async await, and I'm waiting on something that like SFDX threw a terminal prompt, and there's no one there to answer the question that it's asking me because I forgot to override something. And so there is a thing called dyno skimmer, which is, hey, anyone that's been up for 20 minutes, you're doing it wrong on all those one-off dynos, and it just yanks them and restarts those jobs. And that was like my, when you get into like chaos engineering and you're like, hey, stuff is just going to screw up, and I'm just going to kill it, and there'll be more that pick up the slack and fix that. It was kind of the approach there, because I can't guarantee that all of my repos and all of my other stuff is perfect. I also can't guarantee that SFDX doesn't make little changes that break things I have no idea about. Yeah.
And can you also speak about the audit logging aspect of this? Because we saw that you just went into a browser, there was no authentication, and boom, you created as many orgs as you wanted to. So what if you actually screw up and there are orgs which are spinned up, which do what they're not supposed to do? How can we introduce audit logging to make it more secure?
To introduce what?
Audit logging.
Audit logging?
Oh, audit logging. That's a good question. So on the Heroku side, I'm using core logics mostly just to see what's happening and to like get those errors. And if I get, there's some things that are obvious. I've got some alerts that are set up here. So if you're trying to build more than 50 orgs in a pool multiple times in a row, there's something weird happening. I make mistakes all the time. So I had this one where I was gonna go through and see if there's any expired orgs, and then if they are still good, put them back in the queue. But I wrote the if statement wrong and accidentally never was going to delete them. And so my delete queue had like 5,000 in it one morning when I got the alert, and I was like, what have I done? So yeah, that's kind of the operational side of it, and I've done that before. And then the nice thing is with these being Redis queues, I can, Heroku Redis :CLI-A, whatever the name of your app is, and you can go look at those queues. Sometimes, we've made some changes and I've had to blow away a pool so that it could rebuild with like the new version of it. So having access to those queues to be able to, mess with them like that helps a lot.
So I work for a customer. What if I want to leverage what you showed at the beginning, right? Like with the button to create a scratch org for a training or something. What are the things that I need in order to start using that? Obviously, Heroku, SFDX, anything else that's not obvious that we would need?
You'll need a dev hub with some scratch orgs. There's a Trailhead module that I use, which is basically how to set up like a Circle CI. There's a connected app and JWT off, because you'll need those JWT certificate on your connected app and stuff. The big one, if I were a customer, if I were doing like hey, I'm a customer who's making things for other people, more ISV style, please take my apps, here you go. I used to be a customer at a big utility, and our stuff was all mostly stuff for internals, and that's where you'd probably want to IP whitelist, you can only take those requests from people on your network, and maybe you do some other checks to make sure that it is who you think it is. Because like in marketing, we're like, everybody try our stuff here, scratch orgs for everybody, and most customers would not want to, for lots of reasons. You'll also need a GitHub account. I don't have the little Heroku. Does everyone know about Heroku buildpacks? I'll show you what these are. So like Heroku is going to detect that it's a Node app, but I've also got 3 over here. One is Salesforce CLI, so this is like basically install the CLI plugins. I've also installed the Heroku buildpack for Heroku, which gives you all the Heroku CLI commands installed on the box. And then this is Puppeteer. But if I were doing a customer thing, I would want, there's another buildpack that lets you connect to private GitHub repos. It's a place to store your GitHub tokens so that your code doesn't have to be public, but you can still your dynos are authenticated to your GitHub so they can clone from a private repo.
Yeah, one more question, and we may be bordering on the lines of what was discussed in the keynote yesterday. So one of the things which fascinated me yesterday in the keynote was the prospect of using DX with local development. and please forgive me if this is something which is safe harbor, but how would this, the local development impact what you are doing here with all these scratch orgs at scale? Or if that's still an unknown as of now?
Yeah. Most all of our stuff that we're doing, I have one workshop. So like when we spin up that LWC workshop, we then authenticate to that. The problem with not having local development has been, oh, if a customer doesn't have a hub, that's why I'm building this and handing it to them. If we get to local development, there still needs to be typically a Salesforce org, because even though you're building the component locally, it's going and using data service to get stuff from Salesforce and like schema and metadata and that kind of thing, and then proxying that with data service. So I think you would still want to spin up a scratch org and have that, even though if you're building components locally, you need the data or metadata or services from that org, I think. As far, I mean, I'm going to, but I have not used the LWC off core yet for this. It's actually, the front end is done in Vue. But yeah, I'm planning to build that. The deployer pieces of it does totally run locally, so I've got Jess and I can make changes and like that all is more of a local build style. But yeah, I'm
also curious, how much time did it take for you to build this? And was it the developer in you who built this, or was it driven by the marketer?
Marketing wanted to do workshops, and it was just unscalable and unsustainable. And the developer side of me is like, oh, we have SFDX. There must be a way we can use this. Another scenario we haven't talked about because it's not related to the workshops is like booth demos and like things that our sales engineers would use where, a lot of times you give them a demo script, but part of the script of that is we're like making all these metadata changes and adding objects. We're showing people how to build stuff on the platform. And then at the end of your script is like, here's all the steps you need to do to undo all of that so you could get the org back into its initial state. And so now we're just like, just throw it away and get a new one, right? So there's, as a marketer, there's some things that I like about having things that are in an expected state and in source control. How much time did I spend on this? I haven't even tracked it. I would say it's probably been about 2 months worth of work dealing with all of but it's been a 2-year, it's like been little bits of time over 2 years as new requirements come out or new features or like, we didn't know that would not happen, that kind of thing.
You can correlate to the lazy developer part, so.
Yeah, yep.
And did you work on was this just your project or did you have a?
It is, this is my baby.
That's awesome.
It's been shared out and other people have forked it and done some other things with it, but it's mostly, yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit about, you can reach out to Heroku and they'll increase some of your limits. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us about Salesforce scratch org limits? Is that similar?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I can talk to you about that. So one of the benefits of working at Salesforce is that you can go in and give yourself whatever licenses and limits you want. So that's what I did. Okay. And that's the short answer, is I don't pay for anything. The longer answer is what we do with Trailhead Playgrounds and workshop orgs and like spinning up all these developer editions that get used for 24 hours and then sit around for a year until we finally retire those is also not infrastructure efficient. It's probably not even good for the environment if you think about what it takes to do these things. So the scratch org model, I think, it's probably lower cost to serve for us. I have no metrics on this. I don't know what our costs are for running these things. But if you were, comparing, keeping a bunch of sandboxes around to like a scratch org model, I think we as Salesforce would prefer you to do this ephemeral type of approach. And that's one of those things where, like, we try to give everyone a certain number of scratch orgs, and then you can purchase. They're kind of like sandboxes. They're like, if you need more, tell us what you're doing, and I think we'll sell that to you as I don't even know what we sell it for, but some bundle of a whole bunch of extra scratch orgs. Particularly for ISV scenarios, I could see people wanting to do public trials and wanting to do like, hey, I want to build this across 20 different editions of Salesforce in 6 languages, and the matrix of all of that. That's what scratch orgs are for. Yep.
Can you also speak to how you're leveraging Heroku pipelines on this?
What about
Heroku pipelines? Are you leveraging Heroku pipelines?
Yeah.
I saw that in one of your scripts.
Yep. So the pipeline looks like this. And so these are the two production ones. Right now, I'm all on the same git commit, except for this one. So the build process on this one, like if I go back to the code, you'll actually see I'm on a feature branch, and I'm in the process of doing some stuff. I like to get this working locally, just for speed before I move it in. But once I do commit it to Git, this is going to auto-deploy my master branch, which is going to go to dev. And then I can go online, and dev is doing some pooling and doing some other things that I don't always test out. I mean, I test a few of them locally, but I don't really integration test it super well. So I can verify that all that behaves and works, and then promote those to production. And review apps I've tried to use, and they work really well for some other projects that I've done. This one in particular, because we're spinning up more dynos kind of in parallel from the main process, doesn't have, it needs some more meta awareness of what its app name is to be able to spin up more things associated with that app name that review apps don't support as well yet. And so like that whole do a pull request and have an app pop up, it'll totally pop up, but it can't spawn out. So you can't really test that horizontal thing on review apps. Yeah, but pipelines is fantastic for things.
Thank you, guys. Great conversation. Let's go ahead and open it up. So if you guys have any questions, and we have our first question right here, so go for it.
Really cool project you got here. Curious about your tests, kind of what your testing strategy was, whether they're kind of more unit tests or you've got like a lot of integration or end-to-end tests. And I mean, if you're actually like spinning up things and making and validating that orgs are created and destroyed and all that, there's maybe just what some tests look like.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks.
So unit tests are typically testing some of these little modules that I've made. So for example, if I wanted to do, I'm just verifying that I can give you a GitHub repo and I will get the right repo and username and undefined branch, because this thing supports GitHub branches too. So like this is an example of I'm testing this little module of code. And so there's a reasonably decent number of those, but they're not huge. The integration tests are really the ones that I spend more time on, because I'm sitting on top of a stack of things that I don't totally trust, right? So I don't totally trust SFDX at all times. I don't totally trust Scratch orgs. I don't totally trust my own code. And I have other people's repos too that I don't trust. And so what I have on the testing side, if you've, anyone used Jest for like JavaScript testing? Okay, so Jest, I used to do this in Mocha. I moved it all to Jest because you can do parallel execution. Mocha stuff would just take forever because remember, some of these repos take 15 minutes and you can't pull a test. You know, you actually have to. So what I did as far as test definitions, I have a file called test repos, which is basically, here's a list of all the GitHub repos that I want to verify are working against the latest build of the deployer. And then what I do is I have a code gen, and maybe there's a smarter way to do this, but I don't know what it is. I wanted to be able to, for everything in that test repo, I wanted to generate code that's going to execute it. And it's nearly identical, but I didn't want to maintain a file for each repo, but I did want them all to run in parallel, which in the Jest world, each of those needs to be a separate test file. So I built this little code gen thing, and so in my package, I can then run test generate. And so it's going to execute my little code gen file, and what it does is it builds out all of these generated repo tests, and they all look mostly the same, right? But they're all pointed at different things, and this lets them run in parallel, which saves me like an hour of like having lunch and coming back and seeing how these tests happen. And then some of them are pooled, and so they're all calling kind of similar methods here. And so then I can say, okay, this is what I want to execute basically on all of them. I want to verify that launch button eventually shows up, that the error block doesn't show up, because that's usually the place. And then when you're done, I want you to click that delete button so that you get rid of that scratch org, and basically it's the flow that a user would take to deploy it there. And then there's some like basic server tests as well on the integration side. So there's a trial sign up form. So I'm just verifying that you can actually submit the form. And then like I also have a repo that doesn't actually exist, and I want to verify that it fails properly, right?
Just a follow-up, I think this is really interesting. So you're sort of emulating the end user experience, and you're testing from that perspective with these, right? So you're mocking that experience, and you're saying, okay, look at the DOM of that page and see if you're getting the responses that you expect to get. do you test deeper than that, like on the server side for the same process, or this is the way you get, because that's the end user experience, that's the one you care about, and is that why you test this way?
Yes, and it's end-to-end in the sense that, like, if an SFDX command changes in an unexpected way or breaks in a new way, so there's sort of layers to this, and usually if I'm building out a workshop or some repo that I want to execute, I'm running the script from there, and like I'm sort of verifying that the repo builds appropriately. And this is mostly just about the deployer being able to deploy it properly, and then just verifying that I haven't broken something. So yeah, the challenge of trying to do what you would like normally build, which is I want to mock Redis or I want to mock all the SFDX CLI commands, is that I've used them so extensively in the deployer, sort of running exec a lot of times to get access to those SFDX commands, that there's not a good way to cleanly execute some of those things in a small scale. So I'm just like, just do it from the end user experience, and that is going to cover most of the stuff. All of my little stuff is not so much deployments as it is things that I'm, hey, can you get stuff in and out of the pool, and can you like properly interpret it? It's a lot of these little helper functions I'm testing.
And you had a way to override the pool. You could specifically say, I want you to build this for real. I don't want you to get me one from the pool.
Yeah, so part of the test, the very first thing it does is flush the entire Redis queue, and that makes sure there are no things in the pool. So they're all going to build from scratch. And then I, on purpose, build some from the pool, wait for them to build, and then test that if I were to try to deploy that, it would go get it from the pool.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, because otherwise you'll have this state of Redis that is invalid for testing.
Yeah, feel free to hop up to a mic if you guys have a question. Go ahead, Jim.
So you're talking about trying to mass deploy the same code base through SFDX to a lot of different scratch orgs at once, right? And for more of a company, right, or you mentioned like an ISV trying to test it out in all the different versions, different features are enabled, right? And you talk about also doing that with different releases, right, and being on a pre-release. Right now, unless I'm mistaken, I think as partners, as ISVs, anyone can have a dev hub, but you're only going to get it on the current release, and then you can get pre-release if you just like go sign up for a developer edition, or can just get one for 30 days. Is there an easier way to like always be able to deploy, or is there anything out there for saying, hey, I just want to deploy pre-release versus, spring?
All right, everyone close your eyes and visualize the forward-looking statement slide. Okay, got it. We are trying to add that to the scratch.org config file so that you can say this should be next version. And then I can get rid of my stupid pre-release hub and just be like, oh, this needs to go over there. And we've been working on that for a little while.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then just kind of follow up that with all the workshops, just kind of feedback. It's great to see that it's so easy to move stuff with SFDX into a scratch org, but for like these enterprise clients or consulting clients where you have all this wrapped up permission sets and profiles and all this stuff is gummed up, and it's the point where you basically say it's not worth moving a consulting client like an enterprise org to Salesforce DX unless you really have the manpower to untangle it. Do you guys see any like the workshops or anything else making it easier to show how do you actually move like a enterprise org in versus an ISV app?
Funny you should ask. I have a session at 1:30 today called Untangling the Org with SFDX DevTools. Doug Ayers and I are presenting it. And one of the sections that I'm talking about and demoing is migrating permissions and profiles and kind of getting into more of a package-based development model with that. Yeah, it's hard.
Awesome, thanks.
It is really hard. What's that? It is at, I think, 2. Let me verify this because no, it's at 1:30. Setup is at 1. Yeah, so 1:30 we're presenting this session.
Where is it?
You're going to ask all the hard questions.
It's in Moscone West. How's that?
Yeah. We should make an app that has like the schedule for this whole thing.
We'll pull it up
back.
and
Yeah,
share
cool,
it
thanks.
out. Go right ahead in the front mic here.
I don't know, it seemed like a good routine. You mentioned needing a GitHub account. Does this work on other GitHub holders like Bitbucket or GitLab, which will probably be fashionable after yesterday?
Yeah. It could without very much modification. So the only commands that I'm really running are git clone, and so I haven't tried it. Haven't used GitLab, but I'm executing local things as like git clone whatever with maybe a single branch like -b. And so as long as they're using all of the regular Git syntax, you should be able to have that remote pointed at anything. Some of my stuff is specifically going at GitHub URLs as it's building like those deploy targets. Because what you saw is a lot of times I'll put in username and repo. And so I'm constructing GitHub URLs. You would probably have to make some code changes to be like, oh, go point at some other place where your git clone comes from.
Are you handling the private repos too?
No, that would be something you would need to add on a build pack.
Okay.
Just like this thing is going to have little servers. You can think of them as almost like a CI server.
Okay.
And as long as your server can authenticate to that, then maybe you put that as part of the Heroku dyno setup script. Maybe you have it as a build pack that you can add on. Like both those things already exist, but then you could hit private repos or, somebody else's stuff.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thanks.
And Shane, your session is in Moscone West Room 2006.
That's fantastic.
At
I'm
1:30.
going to need to know that.
Just take 3 lefts, and you'll be there.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and take your question.
Cool. This was a great talk. Thanks for all the work on this. My question comes from the kind of customer end, following on from the presentation yesterday on putting your org in source control and running the whole scratch ordeal. Coming away from that, I saw, if my development team needed to wait 30 minutes for an org to come up, we might have a little issue with that. And I was curious if you'd thought about applying the patterns we've used here to the customer side. I want to make a branch and, almost pull a org ready to go out of the queue sort of deal.
Yep. I think that's a really good pattern. The nice thing about having these things sitting there is that you can just SFDX force auth web, log into that org and start messing with it. Yeah, I see no downsides to that pattern, but I can't tell you that I've tried it.
Yeah, I was curious if you've...
Well, we were doing it at workshops downstairs, and it seemed to work pretty well for the LWC workshop that we wanted to use VS Code tools against this scratch org. Yeah, I see nothing wrong with that.
The only downside I can see is sort of the volatility of your code base. If you're always building new scratch orgs from a very quickly evolving code base, it'd be hard to have stuff in pools. So maybe if you had like a post-commit hook or something where you refresh the pool every time the code base changed.
Yeah, or have some sort of stable branch that's like, hey, there's lots of stuff. Like maybe you don't get a pool off of like someone's feature branch, but maybe you can start from certain set places. If you have certain long-running branches, like okay, I'm going to branch off of what's in master. I'm going to branch off what's in like the main checked-in dev branch or something.
Cool.
Yeah, that would be downside.
I have a slightly unrelated question, but so I see a lot of the scripts are written in TypeScript.
Yes.
And it's something I've very recently adopted as well. And I had a big chunk of my early adoption hating it and thought I was very unproductive and always kind of fighting the syntax errors and things. And now I'm on the opposite coin and I love it and I don't want to move back. But I find that I'm constantly kind of stumbling over myself and kind of tripping myself up. I was curious if you have any advice or resources to look for in learning and getting up to speed with TypeScript generally.
I'll tell you what my process looked like. So this was originally not written in TypeScript, and as the thing got larger, you start to get those benefits. TypeScript really came to me from writing all those SFDX plugins, which are, I think you can write them in JavaScript, but like they're mostly supposed to be done in TypeScript, and all of our open source examples of those are also done in TypeScript. So that's where I started using it, and I fell in love with it. There's so many things where I'm trying to call something in someone else's library, and I can't remember if it's synchronous or asynchronous, and I just love being told that I'm doing it wrong, like right away. Some of the other things that showed up really nicely on this one is like standardizing what the schema is for these deploy requests, so that I can put them in there. And then probably the most useful little interface we have is this thing called client data structure, which is what gets sent down to the deployer that's sort of generating those lines of code. And I didn't show you this earlier, but I will just start another one. and then I'll talk you through it while we're doing it. So what you're seeing, these little messages that are showing up, are really sort of the thing that I'm showing to the end user to hide some of the complexity. But what's really in there is this client data structure, and this is what's driving the view app. And so like eventually, I only have one command that's executed so far, which is that git clone. But like if you wanted to see like what actually happened and what standard out is giving you and stuff like that. Oh, so we have an org create. So if I scroll down, then you'll see like the results of that second command, which has, you know, some of the other useful things that are in there. So this became a fairly unwieldy piece of JSON after a while, and it's like, oh, you forgot this one thing that some other process is expecting. And especially right now, like these things are not only used to deliver the UI, but they also are what go into that pool. So someone else is going to pull it out of that pool, and they're expecting that same data structure, and then there's all these permutations. Did you set a password? Did you not set a password? Do you have Heroku apps in there? Because I need to give you links for those too, because I'm spinning up Heroku apps dynamically and deploying them over there and actually interconnecting them to Salesforce and offing them and linking them and doing crazy things. So there's a lot of like little variations on this, and the web client's expecting it, the pools are expecting it, and a bunch of those internal services are all expecting it. And so having that TypeScript stuff is just like, you know, you may not do this, and it helps me not be like hunting errors for crazy times.
Nice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Shane.
Hey.
Hey, thanks. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned at the beginning, so how difficult can this project be possibly be?
Yeah.
And what is the most time-consuming part in your whole project? And you think you have learned the most?
I would say probably one of the things I've learned the most is security. So we have a bug bounty program where a couple of people have very kindly reviewed my open source deployer and probably deployed it locally and run a whole bunch of testing stuff on it. And they're like, you know, I found a way to execute arbitrary remote code on your server. And I love having a bug bounty program because then people get paid for showing this stuff to you. It's like the most fantastic security review you could expect is, hey, review an open source project and find everything you could possibly do to mess with this. The orgs I'm not too concerned about. The real security thing is like, oh, you could get those environment variables that link you back to my connected app on the hub, and you could log into the hub. So that was kind of the thing that it was good to get lots of feedback on. Those things take a lot of time. I would say the TypeScript rewrite was a big piece in terms of how hard could it be.
I thought you were already expert of TypeScript.
Yeah, right. And then the other one was the testing. So moving this to Jest and really trying to, like, what's the right way to test this? I went through various things trying to come up with the right way to do it, to come up with a better way of doing it, and that didn't take all day. And so that I put a lot of time into because eventually I'm just deploying so many different code bases that I can't test them all individually, and all it takes is one command to be wrong somewhere, and then I'm going to get calls or emails about, hey, our workshop is failing, I've got 90 customers here, what can you do? And I'm like, I can't do anything for you, really. You're just kind of hosed because of my fault. So having that testing stuff in place was a whole bunch of work, but I trust it more now.
Thanks for your work.
You're welcome.
Hey, so that looked really cool. I was just wondering how you handled the authentication for the orgs that you create and how you sort of logged into them and how that all worked.
Yeah. The first piece of authentication is the auth from the dynos to the hub so it can make scratch orgs. And because this thing can run locally or in the cloud, it's using process environment variables, but also if you have like a local certificate that you've, like I've got the certificate on my machine rather than putting it like in Heroku settings. And so it goes through this process of connecting to the hub and uses the SFDX JWT grant pattern. And so I'm just giving it the client ID, the username, and then my security certificate. And then once scratch orgs get created, they typically just go down and there's a login, like the results of the force org open command is a URL that's got an access token for that org.
Yeah.
For the pooling, Yeah, it was a challenge because I had to reconnect to orgs that may have been made 12 hours ago or like 2 days ago or something like that. And so in the pool, the thing that grabs an org out of the pool, it goes and it gets that information. And the client data thing that I showed you earlier that from the TypeScript, it has the username. But on SFDX, you can JWT auth to any Scratch org that came from your same hub just with a username and the same client ID that you connect to your hub with and the same certificate. It's like a weird trick that somebody found, and I think Wade wrote a blog about how to do this, but basically as long as you have the username and you connected to the hub in the first place, you can use just that username to get into the same hub because the certificates and the connected app ID match. And so that's how I'm getting back here. So when it grabs an org out of the pool, there is no active access token, most likely. I can't assume that there is. And so then I go through the same process, and it almost is the same command. So here's the client ID, which was already stored there. But instead of using my hub username, I have to use the username for that Scratch org, and then the JWT certificate is going to be the same thing. And then I just put in the instance URL, because my hub is a production org. This has to be a Scratch org, so you have to specify test. And then it auths, and you have a usable access token, and the rest of your SFDX commands can run. Cool. And then, so then to give it back to the user, I set the passwords and then run that org open command, and that'll give me a URL that I can then send down to the client, and they can click a button that hits that URL.
Oh, that's really, really cool. Thank you.
You're
I just had one other question.
Go for it.
So you've got like lots of different types of org in the pool. So you might create, I don't know how many different types you've got, maybe half a dozen or something. So how do you sort of monitor how many you've got in the pool for each different type? Because there must be some complexity around that, I guess.
What a great question. This is the currently active pools by repo username and quantity. So yeah, I started to have this problem. And so what I would do is I would go Heroku, Redis CLI, go in, and then you can say keys, star, and it'll list them, and then you could look at the length of them. But once you have 5, you're not going to want to do that. So I actually built a single little page service that's running on the web. And so if you go to the endpoint, I've got a little helper function here that says pretty much what I would go do on the CLI, which is give me all the keys, which is all the pools that we have, and then go through, and for each one, how long is it, which is how many items are in that list, and then output that. And so that comes back as JSON, and so I can see, oh, there's currently 4 in the platform trial right now. And remember, there's supposed to be 5, so someone probably pulled one out during the time of this talk that it hasn't rebuilt yet. And so this lets me or anyone else that needs to go look at their pools to be like, yeah, there really are 50 for today's workshop. They just have to go scroll down until they find it. There are a bunch.
Cool. So do you kick off like a different worker for each different type then as well? Because you might find that you need like one of this type, one of this type. Or...
No, they're all the same worker,
right.
And they all do the same thing. Go clone a repo, execute that one file, and save it to a pool.
Right.
So they're fairly stupid as to what they do. They don't really do very much, just running bash scripts. I did used to have a separate, actually that's what I'm working on right now. I used to have a separate process for pooled orgs versus live, like you're building it for me right now because I'm sitting and waiting for it. And that got to be, it worked fine. I just didn't like testing it because there's sort of like 2 paths. And what I really wanted to do was just have a common path for all of them. And so I'm trying to make it stupider than it is right now, just to simplify testing and maintenance of some of those things.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we just have a few minutes left. If you guys have any questions, feel free to hop up. Looks like Chuck has another here, but make sure to get those questions in.
Could you compare and contrast this to TrialForce, right? Sort of the legacy way to do something like this. Just kind of paint the picture a little bit.
All right. Raise your hand if you know what TrialForce is. Okay, nice. Okay. I will not do what you asked me to do, but I'll tell you the origin of this. We used to run all these workshops and demos and stuff off of TrialForce, and the pain of TrialForce is, let's say you put a typo on a page somewhere, you would go in to your golden copy and that you hope you never break, and then you would realize you have an error. So then you have to go fix your error, generate a new TrialForce template, and then I'm going to go make sure it's good. So I'm going to go spin up this TrialForce template and get the org, which you get after a few minutes, and you get an email, and you log into it, and you're like, oh, there's this other thing I need to change too. And that turnaround cycle became like a 30-minute thing. And there's also this thing of like, what if you ever break that org? Like you're trying to add something new, and you realize you went down the wrong path, but without like feature branches and version control kind of stuff, how do you ever get it back to whatever you did wrong? Like I turned on person accounts. Like what are you going to do at that point? Right, and so this lets me, like I can just go change something, I commit it to source, and then everything from there on, is now current. The other thing that we had with TrialForce is that it's going through this sign-up API. So even though you came to Dreamforce, we know who you are, you're registered, we have this CRM that we track customers in, and even though you've done all that, you would still have to sit down and fill out this form to get a trial org, and sometimes that would take a while depending on the complexity of that org. So TrialForce has a pools concept, which is kind of where I got the idea. The other problem we had with TrialForce is it would work for workshops for like the morning, and then I think we have some throttling on TrialForce spin-up requests because I think like a denial of service attack on our sign-up API probably looks a lot like Dreamforce workshops. It's like a whole bunch of people requesting orgs all from the same machine all day long, or like from a small router IP address. So then you would switch to another browser, and that would work for like another hour, and then you have to go do something. So TrialForce was just not working very well for us, and maybe it works great for ISVs or not. But this, having it in source control, being able to do branches, being able to do like spring release versus the other, like it's just so much more options. And then I, as a developer, can like try new things and break it, and then like no, go back to that and push it. I hate TrialForce. It was the bane of my existence for a little while.
Yeah, this is actually right in line with that, and that is with the one-day upcoming org snapshot feature. Does this flow into that at all? Are you considering that?
For some of the bigger ones, I think I would like to try it.
Can you explain what that is a little bit more, for anybody who doesn't know?
Yeah, so the org snapshot is, if my understanding is correct, it's built very similar to the TrialForce, but you can snapshot from a scratch org. And so you don't necessarily have this one master template org, but you can get the org just the way you want it, and then capture that as a snapshot, and that's attached to your dev hub. And then you can spin up scratch orgs from that snapshot, and so they are more ready to go. You don't have to run the get ready script after you build the scratch org every time.
All right, thanks.
Yep. I'm kind of looking forward to trying that for a limited set of use cases. More for people who are not developers, who are using like a true SFDX flow. They can like put an org together and then snapshot it. We have been using something as a stopgap, and I think this is only a pilot feature. But this is an example. This is a team that's not my team. They just like my deployer, and so they said, hey, how do we use this? So this is the CPQ team, which they do their own workshops of how to set up CPQ. And in their scratch org config file, instead of specifying an addition, they specify a template. And if you really know Salesforce prefixes, that's a TrialForce ID. And so this scratch org starts off as a TrialForce ID, and then I can set some other things and run scripts against it, and maybe load some data or whatever. But what this lets them do is they're not super hardcore devs. They just go and modify their template, and then they, you can see they're making pull requests just to change this one thing, right? And the upside of this is it lets more people participate in the process because you can get an org to a state and kind of snapshot it, and I think snapshots are going to work similar. The downside is it's a black box. I don't know what's in it. I don't know what's changed. I don't know. I can't go look at it and see like how it got to the state that it got to and like track it. It's just like, hey, here's a snapshot. So I probably will not use it, but I will probably make that a path that's more accessible to other people to just give me snapshot IDs and spin up things and then maybe make a few other modifications to it.
Cool, thank you.
So like your admin scenario that you were talking about yesterday, that may have some potential there. The other thing people were talking about is like app exchange packages where I need to install a bunch of other people's stuff and snapshot it, but you don't always have access to those IDs and passwords or whatever. That's the other use case, I think, for snapshots.
Yeah, the other one we're really excited about is if you have an org that has increased limits, you can go get support to increase the limit on a scratch org, snapshot it with those increased limits. There's no evidence that that's necessarily going to happen, but that's what we're hoping.
Yep, I've used it for that, and I've also used it. I also got the shapes pilot. So some of the orgs I have an org shape as part of the scratch org config file, and that gives you the users and limits of that orgs, but it gives you none of the data and metadata. So it's kind of like a nice, clean way to just do a little bit of stuff that you can't normally do. Yeah.
Great question. And we are just down to minutes. I'm going to ask you a quick question here.
Yeah.
So difficulty and the value of lessons learned aside, what were the least and most enjoyable aspects of this project overall for you personally?
I would say the least enjoyable is probably justifying this to the marketing department. You know? And so hands-on workshops have been enormously popular, and the ability to do this and scale it. And so for them, me spending as much time, why are you doing this instead of like building a demo for a salesperson, right? And this putting hands-on with customers and all these new features, some of which cost money. So hey, I guess you're making some money that way. But really, like what they care about, it turns out is badge scans. And the number of people who bookmark these workshops and want to come and try these things, and they get their badges scanned. We do these at all the world tours, and like it's kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit of a competition, but like I have more scans than some of the sessions and some of the keynotes and stuff like that just at workshops, right? So that I have to translate some of what I'm doing into like what does marketing care about in terms of why, and that's been a little bit of the I would say some of the less pleasant part is just trying to explain this. The fun part has been, I've just learned so much from this, from the plugin. I mean, I probably wouldn't be writing plugins if I weren't writing them to serve this. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I've gotten a whole bunch more knowledge about useful, TypeScript and Heroku apps and like all the one-off stuff. Like I didn't know any of that stuff existed, right? So that's been useful for me. And then sharing it. The number of, like there's a whole bunch of people that have said, oh, I'm going to run a deployer. They pushed the Heroku button and then started messing with it themselves. So I like the fact that this is scaled out and we're using it for so many things. This has also been, it's actually turned out to be really good for what my job is supposed to be, which is enabling sales engineers and stuff like that. So they do a lot of these workshops hands-on with customers and Lightning Adoption team started using it, CPQ team started using it, ISV Technical Evangelism team started using it. Mm-hmm. So as a developer, it's always really exciting when you build something that everyone starts using. Sure. And then you feel like, oh, I can't even calculate how much trial force pain I'm saving some of these people,
So does marketing now say, yes, that was worth the investment?
I think they appreciate the workshops. What goes on here is like way down in the basement, sure. Skunkworks, like I think if anyone actually went in and looked at it and it was like, what, I don't know that this would have been like, yes, this is what you should be doing. It just sort of happened over time and it's evolved. So I've shared it with people and I think they're like, yeah, I went to your internal tech talk about this and I don't know what you said, but they like the workshops and they like the scale.
Cool stuff, yeah. What workshop has utilized this the most?
That is a fantastic question. Process automation.
And how many times? 2,000.
Yeah. So that's 20. Yeah, that's 2,151 deploys of that workshop. This is like elementary process builder thing. So it's one of those things that admins go back and teach their team how to build stuff on process builder. A lot of the Lightning champions have been, sort of like, that's one that kind of everyone started going. The other thing that helps is that it was built for Dreamforce 2017, so it's been out for longer. So some of the stuff now is like, oh, here's the new flow builder, here's advanced flow builder, here's LWC, but they just haven't been hit very often because they're,
sure.
new.
Cool. My last question for you is, what's next on your roadmap? What's coming out next, if anything?
I am going to get rid of Vue on the front end and move that to LWC, just to make my life a little bit simpler. That shared path where pooled orgs and regular orgs use the same deployment and produce the same results, and that just gets stored in the Redis queue. It's the simplification things. And then, I don't know, whatever else comes up.
Sure.
Some of the newer org preference settings, like if you look at the summer release notes, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can now set on Scratch orgs. So a lot of it is not necessarily the deployer itself, it's maintaining this constellation of repos that I deploy and being like, we don't have to do that anymore, we don't have to do that anymore, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just change those config files and have some things. And then, whatever workshops people request. So it kind of starts to follow our roadmap. So like right now, it's LWCs and the new flow builder and chain data capture. But we'll come up with some stuff for Dreamforce release, and there'll have to be workshops around that. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we just have 2 minutes. Jim, you want to just give a quick one? Quick response?
I was talking about using Heroku and using, the DX CLI and everything. And is that kind of the roadmap to kind of make more and more things align with Heroku? That is something that people who are developers should be getting more and more involved in, trying to use Heroku for things like deployments and CI versus using other tools. Just if you can comment on that, it'd be great.
I don't think, I don't know if I can answer that question. For what I had to do, there's nowhere to run all those SFDX commands on core. So this definitely needed to be a Heroku app. For Salesforce, it's easier to do this as a Heroku app trust-wise than it is to be like, hey, I'm going to go do this on raw AWS, and I'm responsible for server security and like patching and that kind of stuff. So I needed like deep level CLI access to a server without the overhead of maintaining that and without the security risks. So that's kind of how it ended up on Heroku. The scalability and the fact that I don't have to pay for it is like a secondary bonus. Yeah. No, if you're messing with Heroku Connect, the main thing is you don't have to write that integration plumbing, and then if you're paying for Heroku Connect, it's exempt from API limits because we're not trying to double charge you on both sides. So for people that are doing like things that are going to hit the APIs a lot, Heroku Connect comes in handy to not deal with those API limits coming in like you would from anywhere else.
Thank you, guys. These are some great questions. Thanks, Susanna, Gaurav, and obviously Shane. And also Chuck for putting this great program together. So let's give everyone a hand.